We're listening to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast, episode 3. Today, we're talking with Steve Schneeberger, Executive Director of the Youth Ministry Institute based in Orlando, Florida. Steve is sharing with us today about the transitions his organization has been through since its founding in 2005.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast, where your host, KIRSTEN BULLOCK, interviews nonprofit CEOs and executive directors to share what's working. This podcast is produced every 2 weeks, and show notes are found at www.nonprofitleadersnetwork.com. Come back often, and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. Any links we talk about will be listed in the show notes. Now, let's get on with the show.
Thank you, Steve, for joining me today.
Hi, Kirsten. How are you doing today?
I'm great. If I remember right, Steve, I think we first met through the Luis Palau Festival in Orlando. I think you were still full-time with the Methodist Church, working with the youth. Does that ring a bell?
Oh, yeah. I remember that well.
Okay. So you moved from that role as a full-time youth pastor into founding a nonprofit. That must have been quite a shift for you.
Yeah, actually, we did it gradually. The Youth Ministry Institute was founded in 2005, and I remained as the church's youth minister for a period of time until 2011, and then I went full-time into this role as the executive director at that point in time.
Okay, great. And would you mind, for our listeners, sharing a quick elevator speech about the work that you do?
Sure. We empower youth ministers to become skilled and effective leaders. Our central program is a 2-year on-the-job training program that consists of 325 hours of instructional training, 120 hours of face-to-face coaching, and then consulting work with the local church. And we really value the work that happens in the local church and want to see the local church be very effective. And we leverage our understanding of youth ministry to help that happen.
Great. And if somebody wants to learn more about what you do, can you share your web address?
Yeah, we're at yminstitute.com. We have 2 locations off of that. We have a location in Florida and a location in the Midwest that services Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, Arkansas, any place that's close to those states.
Okay, fabulous. And just to give a little background about Steve, he's currently the executive director of the Youth Ministry Institute, and he started with youth ministry in 1985, serving churches in Kansas and Florida. 1981 graduate of Shawnee Mission West High School in Kansas, business degree from Baker University, law degree from the University of Kansas. Married to Carol, who's a teacher and former counselor, and he and his wife have lived and worked in Orlando, Florida since 1995. And you have 3 children. How old are your kids?
14, 11, and 10. Our oldest is entering high school this fall, so we're very excited.
That is exciting and a little scary, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, hopefully she's ready, but, you never know until you get into it.
Right. Now, I know founding and growing an organization takes a lot of work, and I'm guessing that you've run into some situations that you didn't quite expect, and maybe some other things went smoother than anticipated. For today's conversation, I'd love if we could explore the different phases you've been through, the transitions that were involved in that, and maybe some things that didn't go so well and some things that went better. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. So let's start with the founding phase. What were the foundation elements that you had in place? And were there some things that you wish that you'd had in place but didn't?
Well, we didn't have anything in place when we started. It was just an idea. I had observed youth ministers failing because of lack of support and lack of education, and there weren't healthy systems to help them be successful. So it's really interesting entering into the world with kind of a new idea that's untested. We profiled other organizations in the United States, and we didn't find anybody who was doing what we had proposed to do. And the we was just me at first. And that was the challenge really, is getting other people to be as excited and as bought in as I was, in the original phase. Building something from nothing is amazing and very scary. My idea going into this was, I thought originally it was God's idea for me, and then for a phase I thought, well, it's just Steve's idea. And it won't go very far if it's just my idea. And then there were some incidences along the way that made me believe again that God was totally involved in this, and that became really encouraging. So the first strategy for us, as I began to talk to other people who had run organizations, was after, profiling what was out there and not finding anything, was really to find some people that could come alongside us as kind of venture capitalists. And those were our first board members. So we approached board members with the idea that they would give of their time and give $3,000 a piece annually to our startup. And amazingly, a number of people came forward. I think we had originally between 8 and 11 board members. Some of those stuck and some of them didn't, through the initial couple of months. And working with them just to set some systems that worked was important. We began to look at the structure of how we were going to go about things and began to, determine what we needed and what we didn't need. And then we went through a process, later on in that birthing process of establishing mission, an official mission statement, and then a visioning statement, which took a lot longer than I thought it would, that we all could agree on. And that, those became pretty pivotal and important, and that directed us and still directs us today.
Mm-hmm. And I love what you say about venture capitalists and really seeing it as an investment to start something new. It's one of the areas that I know a lot of startup organizations struggle with, is where does the initial money come from? So how did you get the idea to do that?
Well, it was actually a friend of mine who I was trying to convince to be on our board of directors. At first, he directed me to his mom, and I think she had some money to spend, but she said no. So then he began to barter these meetings with his friends who he thought were from diverse Christian backgrounds and maybe would have an interest. And only one of those ended up being a board member. But the whole process of actually sitting down with somebody I didn't know and trying to explain this idea that was a hypothetical and how we were going to launch it, was really helpful to me. It gave me practice on kind of the talking points that were going to be important. And through his counsel, even though none of the meetings he set up worked, it allowed me to understand that, okay, we need, and his idea at that point was, you need 20 people that'll get $3,000 each. That'll make it. Well, that didn't happen. But we got a number of people who were willing to do that. And then some who couldn't do 3,000, but could do a little bit less. That was really helpful. So his wise counsel was great. I'm not sure where we would be if, he hadn't really challenged me in that regard. We also got funding from the United Methodist Church, the Florida Conference. They had an organization that was only in operation for 3 years, and it happened to be at the time that we were looking to do this. And so we submitted a proposal to them, and they funded us in the first 2 years a total of $70,000. And then the third year, the organization went away, and they weren't giving any money out anymore. So I look at that as thinking that was God's providence also. We just really wandered into that one and didn't even know it existed when we started. So I'm not sure if we could have survived without that boost in our initial years beginning the organization.
Yeah, that's great. And do you think, having been through that process, do you think if there's an organization, a smaller organization that's been around for a while, not a huge budget, but they're looking at a phase of growth, do you think that might be an approach that would work well for an existing organization as well?
That's a pretty good question. So when we started in the Midwest 2 years ago, we were an existing organization, but they weren't. So we learned a lot of things in that phase of asking board members. And our director there decided to ask people who could actually help him run the organization. So he asked some people with particular expertise and didn't ask venture capitalists. So he's had difficulty, although he's actually done well, but it's been harder for him to put the funding piece together. He's had about 9 fundraisers over 2 years, and that's quite a few to make it all work. So we were an existing organization that and asking him to find venture capitalists, he wasn't able to do that, or chose not to do that. So it'd be interesting to see if you're in the middle of it, if you can find people that would restart your organization. I really think, in fact, a few of our founding board members have told me this, that they're just the kind of people that like to see things start, and they want to be part of that. And they'll give a lot of money and time to that, and then once things are going, then they're ready to roll to something else and start something else. So I'm not sure if it would work for existing organizations to find those folks, but you never know unless you try.
Right. Now, in looking over your budget and in our conversation previously, you mentioned that a significant portion of your funds actually come from the fees for services that you're providing. So the churches that are sending people through the program pay, and that covers about 60% of your costs. And early on, the price you had said probably wasn't high enough. So after the first year, you had raised the price for each person. How did you come to the conclusion that you needed to do that, and was there any pushback from the churches?
Yes, well, we didn't raise the churches that we'd already contracted with. We didn't tell them we were raising the price. We kept it the same as we'd agreed with them. They didn't really know. We made that decision because, first of all, we wanted the price to not be a barrier to the people who joined us for the first year, because we were establishing a price point in a market that didn't exist. So we were guessing, and then we realized, all these churches said yes too easily. So maybe the price point isn't high enough. And then we looked at our bottom line budget and determined that we're not sure if this is a sustainable model in terms of what we're charging the churches anyhow. So that's why we upped it the second year. And ironically, we had twice as many churches sign on the second year, and there wasn't any pushback. Now, we also had in our back pocket this money that the Methodist Church had given us, and half of it was given to us with the expectation we would help churches that were financially strapped or were small member churches. So we were offering some matching grants at that point in time too. So that helped those churches who couldn't really afford it. And then, but what we've realized over 10 years of doing this is that it's whether a church values youth ministry or not, whether they can afford it. Even the churches that seem to be not as wealthy as others, they value youth ministry. They put some things together. We've had many churches who have found individual donors who want to give above and beyond what they give to the church to make this thing happen. To enhance their youth ministry, to get things rolling. And so those churches make it work, just because of their value systems lined up in that way. The churches that don't value youth ministry, they're not going to pay for what we offer, and they're probably going to hire the youth minister at a minimum salary or ask them to do more work than they pay them to do. So that's what we found in the marketplace of churches, at least.
Okay. And that probably does translate to other areas too. If people find that it's important, they'll make the time for it and make the money for it.
Yeah. You think you're actually led to believe that it's all in the marketing, and why marketing is important. And maybe there's a part of marketing I don't really understand. Well, I know there is. There's a lot of it I don't understand. But what we find in the end, if somebody needs what you offer, they'll pay for it, and they'll pay the value of it. And if it is a valuable product, then the price isn't really the value. The price is just what it. And what we find is that we can't convince somebody to hire us if they don't want to hire us and they don't value what we offer. So it doesn't work that way.
Right. And after a few years, you mentioned you transitioned from what you call the child phase into the adolescent phase for the organization. What was happening around that helped clue you into that shift? And were there some things that you and the organization, the board, needed to start doing differently?
Yeah, it was pretty obvious. Again, our venture capitalist board members just got tired and not disengaged, but you could tell they were ready to move on to something new. So they began to move us. And if you're board centric, which we are, then you listen to your board members, you engage and empower them so that they actually are helping drive the organization. So when they began to say, gosh, I'm tired of being on the board, because we started these guys without any term limits. We just said, we just need you to help us start. So at about the 5-year mark or 4-year mark, people were beginning to fall away. And then we began to reorganize how we invited people to be part of the board. We set term limits so that we didn't burn anybody out. We took away the $3,000 fee so we could ask people that didn't have that kind of capacity. We asked youth ministers to be on our board. They usually don't have that kind of flexibility to give those large amounts annually to another organization other than their church. So, and then we began to think, well, what do we need these board members to do? So we looked at our organization and began to identify where we needed to grow, and we asked board members to fill specific roles in helping us get there. So that was kind of a fun process. As we began to select people, we began to say, okay, when we ask them, what do we want to ask them to do? Because they're just not going to come on here and just sit in the seats. We want them to actually do something. So we asked people, and we asked accountants because we wanted them to pay attention to some particular accounting needs. We asked a lawyer that was involved with trademarks when we decided we wanted to copyright our stuff and take our mark and make it legal. So that's been a neat process that we've been in over the last 5 or 6 years.
Okay, fabulous. And now you've mentioned that your organization is entering young adulthood. What are some of your goals for the next few years, and what are some things that you've made sure to put into place for this next season?
Well, as anybody that's been through young adulthood knows, when you enter it, you kind of begin to think, well, now what do I want to do? I know who I am. I know what my strengths are. Not who I want to be for the rest of my life. And that's kind of the way it is with the Youth Ministry Institute. We're at the 10-year mark. We feel like we know who we are. Our mission's pretty clear. Now we just need to figure out who we want to be for the next 10 years. And that could change. It would be mission-centric, but how that's expressed will be different. So in the fall, we're entering a strategic planning process where we're involving our past and our present board members and our donors, our past students, our current students, all of our employees, and just begin to think about, what do we do next, and who are we going to be for the next 10 years? We've begun to establish a national presence with the addition of our Midwest group. So we're actually in the midst of changing our organizational structure. And a year from now, that will be fully vested, and we'll have a different kind of national board that will actually include people on our board from outside the state of Florida and all over the country. That will mean a whole different shift on how we organize board meetings and what we're asking those board members to do. We're thinking that our regional areas, the Midwest and Florida, those managing boards of those areas will have more to do, while the national board will have a different role. So we'll be defining that and trying to figure that out as we grow into young adulthood also. And really, from a national presence standpoint, we want to figure out, or I want us to figure out, how we influence the conversation, not only around youth ministry, but more importantly around how the local church reacts to our changing culture. I think that's pretty critical, and I think oftentimes youth ministry is overlooked in that conversation. And I think it should be more of a highlighted area, because the youth in our churches now, are going to be the adults in our churches tomorrow. And if you don't understand them well and what really connects for them, then we're at a loss as a church. So I don't know how we can do it, but in some way I think that we can influence that conversation in a way that's pretty positive for the local church and making the local church more effective.
Right. And figuring out how to do that is perhaps this next season.
Yes. Yeah, it is, because there's a process. And, there's a million ways to peel a potato. And every time you pick up a new potato, you're going to do it differently. So it's not like there's only one way to get at all of this. And so we just want to find the ways that are most effective, and maybe there's several ways. And so we approach all of the things we do in that manner. How do we figure this out? And what might work tomorrow may not work today. So we're going to do it a couple of different ways. So just, that whole process of figuring all that out is really interesting to me. I like that. It's, the entrepreneur in me, really gets turned on by that. And, but it also can be frustrating, when you can't find it immediately. So we continue to put our nose in the grindstone and work at it.
Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about how things were at the beginning and the whole situation that was around you, and this, what probably felt like a big obstacle in front of you of trying to figure out how to set everything up, if you could talk to your former self and give yourself one piece of advice, what would that be?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I think just stay true to what you set out to do is very important. And I don't know how I would change it or do it differently. At every point and every intersection when there's a decision to be made, I feel like we made the best decision that we could given the circumstances that we had. So there are always things that can be improved, and but I'm not sure if I have any regrets thus far. I think that we've done a pretty good job of narrowing down the choices and picking the best one. So obviously experience is a great teacher. So, but I'm not sure if I would forego any of that experience to give my former self particular advice to avoid something. I think all of it has been pretty good.
Okay, great. Fabulous. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for coming onto the podcast and sharing your information, experiences, and knowledge with us. Really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you, Kirsten. I appreciate the time. It was a lot of fun.
Great, thanks. And thanks to all our listeners for joining in. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast with Kirsten Bullock. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, nonprofitleadersnetwork.com, to your friends and colleagues. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. Join us next time for another edition of the Nonprofit Leaders Network podcast.